the people who are, he says, immersed completely through and through in the service of Hashem. So, they just need a little bit of an upgrade during Elul to be a little bit more, even better than they were all year round. So I can see how it's plausible that blowing that shofar will be just a little bit to get them over the edge and be. Because what about people like us, he says, where we're surrounded by sin all day long, our heart is as hard as a rock, and he says, so what kind of impact is the blowing the shofar going to have? He says, let's get real. So he says it's true. But there's a third principle, and he says there's another principle, and that principle is called leverage. For those of us who have taken mechanical sciences, leverage means if you align the force, that you can harness certain forces, and if you position yourself properly, and if you understand the science, right, you can these water pumps, and when we went to Connecticut, there was one of these colonial era things, like this well, and there was a huge log, and you pull down on this end, and the bucket goes up on that end. But we have it all the time anywhere. You press a foot pedal, and the garbage can lid pops up. So you can, if you do it right, you can have a little stick and push it down, and then a boulder will roll down the mountain if you have the right pedal. So he says you have to understand what the shofar is supposed to do. He says, if you blow a shofar, right, that might, you might walk to this shelf and take out a siddur and say time to say David, right? That people can do. What if, when they blow the shofar, you walk to the shelf and take off two things? You take off the siddur for David, and you also take out the Mr. Hashem. It's time to study Musar. He says this is his line. He says going to he calls it the Beis HaMusar, which was something that never really caught on that much. It was a dedicated room for Musar study, but we have that in abstract form. What if when you heard the shofar, you said that my mission is now to spend 10 minutes today studying Musar? He says a couple of visits to the Musar place in El is not something, the bar is not that high, and it's not an overwhelmingly difficult thing to do. And actually, even for people like us, blowing the shofar might be enough to get us to do that. And that is very powerful, he says. So like the lever that pushes, he says, if the shofar can just get us to spend those extra few minutes, as repeatedly as possible, studying Musar, the force of the Musar, we're harnessing a power that there's no limit to what that can do. He says that should be the game plan for us during Elul, and again, parenthetically all year round. So when getting back, that could tie back to the original question. Any time we're confronted with anything, we always want to come back to, okay, so now what? And now what always has to be moving us forward, moving the needle in some positive direction. Everything that we get in this world, good or bad, should somehow help us move the needle in a good direction. Otherwise, what's the purpose of it? And if nothing else, if there's any room for improvement in our commitment, studying Musar, anything that we can channel in that direction is a good investment of energy, because that force that we can harness is the most powerful force, and that can transform anyone into anything. So again, we have many areas that we strive to improve on, but he says that's the most fundamental, because that's transforming. And any investment of emotion, whether it's positive or negative, we believe in, especially now, to channeling our emotions in a constructive way. What can I do? What's my response? That is always, pretty much always. Maybe not if you hear somebody drowning in the river, the appropriate response is not to study Musar. Maybe you hold out the Mesilas Yesharim for them to grab onto, so you can pull them out of the river. But pretty much, short of that, it's always an appropriate response, because it brings us back to, it gives us the direction to become what we need to become, and that's the most fundamental. It's also, they said, the one that Satan fights the hardest against. So in principle, it's the easiest, and that apparently was something, I didn't see this in print, but the Rosh used to quote the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, said that he'll fight us on anything and get us to do the worst things in the world if he can. But if he can't, He says, at least don't study Torah. And if you can't even win that battle, please don't study Musar. He says, because that's the poison for him. So Yisrael will do anything to get us not to study Musar. And as a matter of fact, I saw someone that said another one of his themes that he mentions is that if you look at, getting back to the Southern again, one of our favorites, somebody should tell him that he gets the most airtime of anybody in our class. More than Avram Avinu, more than he comes up every single class. We're always talking about him. So it says, and it gets back to the question of what does he, who is he? What is he? Who is he? So he says in Jewish literature you can come away with two distinct ideas. There is you'll read a lot of things that will basically indicate that there's, human beings, we have weaknesses, challenges, whether they're physical, we have our desires, our appetites, and emotional issues, and midos, and the Yetzer Hara is just a fancy way of saying psychology, human nature, the weaknesses of human nature. It's just a kind of a way of putting a spin on it and pretending that your weaknesses are like a person that you're battling. It's really just yourself, nature. Also, if you read other things, like the Midrashim we were just talking about, you very much get the impression that you're talking about an actual individual, an angel or something that has conscious ideas and has a personality. So which one is it? So he says, actually the way he says it, to be precise, he says, you get the impression that it's just natural human nature. You also get the impression there's some kind of dark force out there that wants us to sin because just for the sake of sinning. And which one is it? He says it's both. And we can prove it. Because he says if we all know that different people have different challenges. Right? Some people struggle in one area, other people struggle in other areas. And it's not the same. No two people are the same. So that just indicates that a lot of his personality, a lot of the reason that I struggle with this, you struggle with that, is with the personality. So clearly there's an element of just human nature. And because human nature is a little different for everyone, the Yetzer Hara is a little different for everyone. So that shows you that the first explanation must have some truth to it. That there's, on the other hand, he says there are also certain struggles that human beings have that are irrational. And those can only be explained by some kind of spiritual force. For example, he says, you'll find someone who loves honor, loves to show off, and loves accolades, but you can't get them to make a mishaberach in the shul. They're not interested in giving to charity. So why is that? Why would a person who wants to be recognized and praised for every single thing, but not want to do it, when it comes to a mitzvah? That can only be explained that Yetzer Hara is specifically, fighting against. I would say this is, this. Might be able. I don't know if I've ever met anybody like that. Honestly, I can't think of. But you think about people who stand up for every oppressed person, but they can't. When it comes to Jews, we don't care about the Jews. That's an example. That'll be an example of. But it affects us as well. It's just the example of a spiritual force that we call it badafka. It's just against the good. So he says. So what's this? So it's always always comes back to the same point. He only has one agenda. So he says, why would a person not study Musar? Because it makes no sense. He says it's so easy and it's so effective. And why is that the one thing people have? He says, it can only be because the Yetzer Hara is like an actual force fighting against you. He says, it's irrational. Everybody should be doing it. They say Ronald Reagan, I don't know this firsthand, but one of my teachers quoted it. He said, you ask somebody, what's your weakness? Like in an interview or, the goal is to answer the question by really showing one of your strengths and pretending it's a weakness. So I asked Ronald Reagan, what's your weakness? He was a great communicator. He said, my weakness is I'm a terrible communicator because my policies are so good. Everybody should be signing on to them. And if they're not, it's only because I must not be doing a good enough job of communicating them. So that's the thing with Musar. It's so effective and it's such a terrific idea. The only reason that the whole world is not running to study Musar could only be because the Yetzer Hara is battling against it tooth and nail, and the only reason he does that is because he knows that that's the one thing that will spell trends.
Certain Hasidim really don't believe in Musar. They believe only in studying other parts of the Torah.
I can't speak to that. I don't know of anybody who doesn't believe in Musar. It might be that they have a different approach to Musar, or that they call it by a different name.
Oh,
For example, I know one of the people say there was an anti-Musar movement. There was a backlash to it, and part of that I think was simply that innovation is always suspect in Judaism, as it should be, and sometimes the suspicion, is warranted. Sometimes it's not; it goes a little overboard, and sometimes it's like a corrective measure, which they say that people say that sometimes it's a healthy thing where you just kind of like when you're studying Talmud, someone says an idea, you immediately jump and argue, and then you argue, and then you kind of you resolve all the, it's a healthy process of kind of making sure that everything is staying within the bounds. But one of the Soloveitchiks, the Briskers, are kind of known for being kind of the non-Musar camp. My brother went to one of the Brisk yeshivot in Israel, and he said that everyone talk about Musar all the time. He said the only way to have fair Hashem is to study Musar and to cry. That what they was against was having it a fixed period during the daily curriculum. He said it should be more of a personal thing, that each individual, as needed. But that was the whole difference. It wasn't like,
right.
but part of it was, again, I think that it may tie into the original opposition, again, institutionalizing anything. The idea is that the Torah is a package of, we have 613 mitzvahs, and whatever was good for the last 2,000 years should continue to be. How can you possibly change? There are all kinds of movements in Judaism, right? There is no orthodox movement. Why not? And it's not a movement. We don't believe in moving. We are we are. Everyone else is moving. Why are you? So why was there a Muslim movement or a Hasidic movement? Some movements, like the Karaites, they moved, then they just moved right out of there, right? So you have to, if you're going to be Rabbi Shal Salans or the Baal Shem Tov, you have to come up with a way and say, well, this is the same thing we've been doing all along, but now we're going to do it differently. But it's still going to be the same thing.
Right.
That's tricky. That's why you needed really great people to do that. And there was always going to be a challenge. Well, why is it the same thing? And if it's the same, then why is it different? So, I read Rabbi Baum, he just passed away actually. So in his history, he quoted from the Hasidic tradition, and I'm not really familiar with it. I only know it from. So there was a difference between the Baal Shem Tov and his disciples and their disciples, and so there was apparently a kind of some kind of offshoot. I think it was Shivka and Kotz, because like one led to the other, and at some point there was some question about even within the Hasidic movement they were going too far and becoming too radical. So they had one of these big Hasidic weddings. They had them back in Europe too, and all the rebbes were there, and they had they convened this court to determine whether this particular offshoot was going too far. But so this is the part that I remember. He said that the Rebbe, the older Rebbe, whoever it was, said the Shulchan Aruch is the King's Highway, like the Derech HaMelech, King's Highway, and over time that highway became blocked with detours and roadblocks and collapsed bridges, whatever. So the Baal Shem Tov found a detour. He cut a path through the mountains, through the forest, and a roundabout way that would bypass all the obstacles and get you back onto the King's Highway. Mm-hmm. And he says, and you're trying to cut an even more treacherous and even more precarious road. Get back to the King's Highway as fast as you can. That was basically the way it was. So if you think about it that way, the idea of sometimes you just have to kind of do a workaround to get past an obstacle with the goal of merging back onto the main road. That's one way to think about it. With the Muslim movement, for example, I know that they try to prove in the Or Yisrael, in that book, which was his collected letters, Or Yisrael's disciple Rav Itzler has a lengthy introductory essay, and one of the things that he does is show in every generation, this has been going back to the times of the Gemara. He has examples of in the Talmud. It says that Rabbi so-and-so, whenever he went to this place, he would always say this to himself. He said, what do you think that was? That's studying Musar. He didn't have in the Source Hashem. It wasn't written yet. So instead, he took it from Tanakh, and he repeated it. He says, you can see how these things go back and back and back, generation after generation. So they were just kind of the same way we institutionalize things. We have, in the yeshiva, they study Mishnah Berurah every day. Well, they weren't doing that 200 years ago. That's because there was no Mishnah Berurah. And the Shulchan Aruch was also controversial. That wasn't innovation. Before that, there was no Shulchan Aruch, but they needed one. The Shulchan Aruch was there to take the knowledge that everyone else just kind of got, and then to organize it in a way. Well, why didn't we need it until now? Well, there were reasons. The Jews were more spread out. There were persecutions. People were getting killed. The rabbis were, there were breaks in the communication. Whatever it was, there were always reasons. But I think Rabbi Salanter, part of his argument was, if Musar is just a part of Torah, but it's a part of Torah that gets overlooked. So you say, well, why weren't they overlooking it in the past generations? I don't know, but they weren't. Maybe because they knew the whole thing and they just got it all, or maybe because. But he says we see in our times people, again, the Yisrael is able to get us to. You want to study Torah, fine, just not that part of the Torah. All he wants to do is make sure that we don't overlook this part of the Torah and make sure that it's part of the curriculum. So that's all he did. He said this should always have been the case and probably always was, but for whatever reason, it isn't getting to be that way now. So that always has to be the argument, that we're doing the same thing and just repackaging it.
Okay. Isn't Pirkei Avos?
Yeah, Pirkei Avos, exactly. Look at Moshe Rabbeinu. What do you think we're reading about this week and last week and next week? What do you think of this whole parsha? Blessings, curses, and warnings, and that's what he's doing. So it's
Maybe short from the stuff.
It's a good one. It's
Even to explain it in Hebrew at
yeah.
the time.
It's
Rabbi Gass used to try to say it was, he also had trouble. It was self-development.
That's what I feel like
yeah.
character development.
It's the parts of the Torah that directly speak to our issues and parts of the Torah that we can use to become the kind of person we have to become. He says something very interesting of Yisrael Salanter, and it's often I think overlooked also. He's famous for think about Musar as motivational stuff and inspirational stuff but he says when you study a part of halacha, you really in-depth intellectual analysis. He said if you have a weakness in Shabbat or in Kashrut or in business, whatever, if you study those laws, if you have a businessman, he says, I have a difficult time. I'm always making deals and it's easy to cut corners and sometimes I'm not sure if it's hard to be 100%. And so open the Shulchan Aruch and study the laws. And maybe it's not the type of business that you do, but if you're involved, studying Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, blah, 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 and you get involved in the different. He says you'll find that you'll be a more honest businessman. He says because the intellectual engagement with the Torah, your mind is thinking about. He says it works the same way. He says it can be. He says I think Kemat Yoter, like it's almost more effective than the other. All from a fear of God, which is also important. He says the involvement, and that's why in the yeshiva, even the Musar is intellectual. There's a lot of discussion, like we do in the class. Why did Abraham do this and why didn't he do that? Because there's an intellectual part of it too when you're studying it. The involvement of the mind in these areas, it changes. Look, the Torah, it comes down to the Torah. That's what Rabbi Salanter could not get away from that, right? The Torah is the beginning and the end of it. There's nothing else besides the Torah. So all he was saying was that when the Chovot HaLevavot, right, written 800 years ago or something, right, well before Rabbi Salanter. Why did he write the book? It was a Sefer Musar. And one of the things he says in there, he has all these stories. It's written very kind of old-fashioned style. But he says that somebody came over to ask a Talmudic question to a wise person, and he said, well, have you completed all the relevant aspects of the Torah that pertain to your own self-development, that you now have time to ask me these theoretical questions that are, and he says, like, he spends a lot of time chastising him and embarrassing him for having the chutzpah to. Obviously, today we do engage in abstract Talmudic analysis, but even back then there was this. The point, you can define Musar as practical Torah. The Torah says, the big chiddush, the big insight of is that when the Torah says be a good person, it's not just telling you to be a good person, but it's also telling you how to be a good person. It's not just telling you how to be a good person, it is also the tool to become a good person. We don't think of it that way. The Torah is not just saying you should do this, it's saying you should do this, and if you read this and if you study this, you will become that. This will transform you. That's really the insight. The Torah itself is what transforms us internally. And that's the one thing you will not find You go to Barnes and Noble and look at the self-development of all kinds of ideas, and there are good ideas, and we incorporate them. The Sefer Chashbon and Nefesh, they say, was based on ideas of Benjamin Franklin, and it was translated into Hebrew. I don't know if it was Rabbi Salter himself who encouraged it, but one of the later generations, and they made a whole Hebrew book. You'll find it on a Musar shelf in any yeshiva library. But ultimately, the real power that we have is the Torah. Hashem says, and we say the Shema, and the Shema says, if you do the right thing, this will happen. Not just, we should do it so that we know it. It's if we really, the Shema is also Musar, right? That's what it is. It's a daily, and if I speak to myself, if we actually thought about what we were saying while we said it, and it's the same exercise. It's tefillah in a certain sense is also an exercise like that.
So who went into the cave? Who was in the cave?
His son. His son.
Yeah,
and his son. Yeah.
And then he came out and he was judgmental, whatever, and Hashem says, you're not ready.
Yeah.
He goes back.
Right.
So they know Torah, so there was more to it. So when they went back, did they learn more Torah? Did they learn more lesson?
I guess they
So
and I guess at a certain level, that I think, again, this goes back to the whole, at a certain level, if you master the Torah enough, again, it's the whole idea. Hashem is one, the Torah is one. We have different departments. I have my Talmud department and my Musar department. Really, I think at a certain, say the Vilna Gaon at the end of his life would just study the Chumash. Because when he read the Chumash and everything else kind of just came along with it, he knew it in his head. And so we can't do that. So now I'm doing Bava Kama, but I'm not even thinking about. But it's really all interconnected. That's part of it. So why indeed do we spend a lot of time doing abstract, logical things that have nothing to do with? But part of the answer is the Torah is a package. You could just study Musar, but it would only be as valuable as the Torah. It's a part of Torah, and we believe that the proper way to study Torah is to master the Torah, and then it's all one package. So I remember that they said in Yeshiva once we were having this conversation, not about Musar really, but about Halakha. Torah is how to live your life. So basically, the second and the days line into three primary periods: even in the morning, intense, in depth, and then you cover more ground in the afternoon and the evening. That's the big but really, the intense analysis is where you're really delving in, and then all the rest of the day when you're getting more information that helps you because now you have more. So basically, the second and third period when we gather all that information is to help the first period where we get in depth. And the first period where we learn in depth is that when we do the Mishabura for 20 minutes after Shacharis, we can do the Mishabura and know what to do. So the Pekiyos helps the Ian helps the Mishabura. So the whole purpose of the day is the 20 minutes when we study Mishabura, we learn what to do, but now we learn it much better because now it's part of this whole, knowledge. But in a certain sense, there's truth to that because the idea is, the Torah is a mitzvah in and of itself. And we do believe that the Torah study and knowledge of Hashem, which is essentially what Torah study is. But in a practical sense, what the Torah does for us is that it enables us to approach life with a Torah perspective. And that means every decision we make, we believe that when we are studying even things that are abstract and not related directly, but the principles and the way of thinking and the kind of connection to the knowledge of Torah itself, which is why people go to rabbis for medical advice or political advice, not just because, they think a lot, so their brains are very smart. It's because they have access to Torah wisdom. The Torah is a body of knowledge. There's a famous story about Rabbi Shlomo. There's different versions of it, but essentially, the point of the story was that he would go around giving these amazing, brilliant lectures, and he would put up a list of source materials, and he'd give the lecture, whatever, and then one day some pranksters took down the sheet and put up a bunch of random citations, and he gets in and takes a look, and he turns pale, and he hesitates, and he gets up and delivers a brilliant lecture with totally random. And they say he didn't hesitate because he wasn't sure if he could do it. He hesitated because he wasn't sure if it was showing off to do it. But Rosh Shiva used to say, so how was he able to do it? He was able to do it because, and he actually quoted something in the Gemara itself. It says, "San da'ar achad," which is Aramaic, it's not Hebrew. Sadan haaretz echad hi. Sadan is like a tree stump or like a block of wood. Basically, it says if you buy a piece of real estate, let's say you're doing 10 real estate deals, one property in China, one in Poland, and one in Africa. So you can go onto one of those fields and you put up a fence, and then you become the owner. And simultaneously, all the other 10 fields become yours, if that was the deal. Why? I'm not anywhere near there, but the earth is connected. It's one piece. So if I get a foothold in any part of the earth legally, it's the same thing with the Torah. Underneath it's all connected. So if you know it well enough, you can start anywhere and go anywhere. So it doesn't matter if it's kind of random. You start at one spot, you're able to connect it all. So if you know the Torah like that, so it's not a question. Well, how does learning Bava help me when the sales are showing better? It's one thing, but the real, kind of the it's like you can imagine, like one of these gigantic tools, and we go like the dentist, and they have that gigantic X-ray thing, and like there's a little thing, and this whole, it's all there to focus on one little thing, in that spot. So again, there's multiple values in Torah study. I'm sure, and we should oversimplify, but there is this idea that ultimately the direct, Rabbi Shlomo says that the Torah heals the Yetzer Hara, that we know. Chazal tells us that, and he says there's one aspect that whenever you're studying Torah, you're protected while you're studying Torah. But there's the second thing, which is really pretty much the main one, is that the Torah directly addresses our issues and fixes them. For that, we need the direct approach. Right? Like say, the following can help as part of a healthy diet. You need the help. You can't just take antibiotics and then not eat anything. You're not going to be healthy. But you can eat 3 meals a day. You're not taking antibiotics. You're not fighting the infection. So the most is the antibiotics. And, maybe you can look at the Torah as the healthy diet. And it's, in fact, maybe, I don't know if that's a good analogy, but I think it's, okay. Okay. So we didn't get into too much halacha Rosh Hashanah, but that was kind of like halacha Rosh Hashanah. So, and we talked about blowing the shofar, so that's. So
I have another question, but next week.
Okay.
I need to work over there.
Okay. So next week will be one more before Rosh Hashanah, and we'll take it from there.
We just send you off target.
Nothing's ever off target. It's all connected. Right?